Good morning. Today is July 16th, 2026, and welcome to the New Possibilities Hour, part of the Will Work for Food project, founded by Natalie Armstrong Motan. Every week, our new and improved and expanded team, Kim Best, Felicia Harris Haas, Jean Lawler, David Schraga, and I join Natalie to host another cutting-edge webinar for mediators, arbitrators, lawyers, and everybody who negotiates. As most people know, there's no charge for these great programs. We ask people to contribute to a food bank if you like what you see. And since we began the series in 2020, our audiences have been so generous in contributing in honor of our great speakers. One of my favorite parts of the program each week is when we announce the running total of just how much our generous audiences have contributed over these past many years. So could we have the number, please?
Yes, Chip, it's my pleasure. Good morning, everyone. We just hit a major milestone recently, and as of today, we are at $1,004,253.98. That's millions of meals donated by our generous audiences and supported by our wonderful speakers. Just a reminder to please let us know about your contributions. You can email Natalie directly. You can put it in the chat. There's a link on our site, and you'll find the button. We really appreciate your support, and thank you everyone for your participation and attendance today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, David, and thank you, everyone. Today we have a really terrific program lined up. Professor Graham Bodie, who's a professor of media and communication at the University of Mississippi. He's also the Chief Listening Officer of the Listen First Project, and he will present on how to be a good listener and other dangerous listening myths. Most of us think we know how to listen well, stay quiet, nod, repeat what we heard. But real listening is harder, much more powerful than what you'll find from a simple Google search. It's also extremely important to our work as mediators and negotiators. This session today will seek to uncover the hidden traps behind some of the most common advice about listening. We will explore what the research actually says and how shifting our listening habits can
Where's
open
the
stronger relationships, better leadership, and deeper understanding. Professor Bodie, welcome. Please tell us a bit about the food bank to which you would like people to contribute if they're in a position to do so. And then on with the presentation. We're all ears. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Jeff, and the rest of the team. Appreciate the introduction, and I really appreciate the effort in general. The ability to give back, I think, is an important opportunity for citizens in general. The pantry of Oxford and Lafayette County here in Mississippi is where you'll be donating, and they do a lot of good work. In February, we actually had a really massive ice storm here that shut our city and county down for several weeks. In fact, we still have debris currently that's being picked up outside of the county, and the pantry was a prime contributor to those families who, right, couldn't get to a grocery store even if they were able to. The grocery store for a little while didn't have food, so the pantry was stocked and ready to go. The church that I go to here locally is also a contributor to that food bank, putting people in opportunities to volunteer during the week who are able. So it's close to my heart. So I appreciate the support that you can provide. I'm going to share my screen, and you should see me with some slides at this point. We'll get started. So before I launch into what I want to talk about, I want to ask each of you to spend 1 minute reflecting on the most common advice you've heard about listening. If someone came to you and asked you, how can I be a good listener? What would you tell them? So I'm going to pause and give you 1 minute to reflect on that, and then ask you to chat that in when that minute is up. There's already some responses coming in, so if you're already finished with your advice, you can go ahead and type out that advice and hit enter in the chat. So seeing a lot of things like focused, eliminating distractions, asking questions, 2 ears and one mouth, attempting to understand, concentration. We've all been told that if we just try really hard, we can fully comprehend and understand another person in unbiased, non-judgmental ways. And that's really the primary myth that I want to unpack today. Listening, in my framework, isn't about eliminating bias or achieving total understanding. It's about creating conditions where a particular conversational partner can share openly and where meaning is co-constructed. And of course, this phrase here, my current listening habits will enable me to engage successfully in this conversation with this person at this moment, is much more of a mouthful than I am a good listener. And so we often shorten it to I am good or I am a bad listener. So before I unpack that specifically, I just want to briefly say that what I mean when I say myth is a story that we've created and handed down that helps us understand the world. So inside of every myth is some truth, or at least some hopeful truth. And that's as true about listening as it is about other things that we might have beliefs about that aren't necessarily grounded in a full factual truth. So, very much like each of you have your own personal definitions of what it means to be a good listener. Scholars also don't agree. No surprise there about what constitutes good listening. But if you look at all of those definitions, what you find is that the most common way to conceptualize listening is as a set of cognitive actions. Things like attention, comprehension, interpretation, evaluation, things that people enact when they process oral information. From this perspective, competent listening is defined as attending to all available information in a way that best preserves both what was said, what scholars call the content level meaning, and what was meant, or what scholars call relational meaning. On its surface, this seems reasonable. If I am to be a good listener, I need to put forth effort to fully comprehend another's speech, what they say, what they mean, what they're trying to do, and what they want to accomplish. And a popular way to explain this is to contrast listening with hearing. While hearing is a set of physiological processes that provides us with the signals that we parse into words and phrases, listening is an inference making process that involves decoding meaning from those signals. You'll read that kind of a definition in a basic textbook, and that conceptualization of listening is situated within what scholars of human communication call the linear model of communication, which proposes that communication consists of an information source that we call the sender, who encodes a message that is then transmitted through some channel and decoded by a recipient. This is based on what we might call a conduit metaphor, meaning that humans simply encode their thoughts into words and send those words through the air to a willing recipient who then unpacks those words to derive the thoughts of the speaker. Call it the hypodermic needle or the magic bullet model of communication. The point is the same. Communication is simply a process of sending and receiving information. You'll find the linear model of communication in most textbooks with an added feedback loop, meaning that receivers can become speakers and speakers become receivers. But the point is pretty much the same, that we're exchanging messages in order to share our thoughts and perspectives with others. Using the linear model, we find studies that try to estimate the amount of time we spend listening versus speaking versus reading and writing and other forms of communication in work and other domains of life. The linear and linear plus feedback, or the interactional models of communication, can be contrasted to the transactional model of communication that suggests that communication is less like a process of converting thoughts into words and vice versa, less like a process of the exchange of ideas, and more like a cooperative activity in which communication is simultaneous. Now, it's not that each person is speaking at the same time, but that the acts of speaking and listening are not separate entities. They are co occurring even within the single person. Our quote unquote roles in the conversation are reflexive, just as looking in a mirror can prompt you to change your appearance, thus changing your image in the mirror. Our roles in a conversation change as we adapt to the ever changing nature of communication. When the transactional model of communication, what it implies is that speaking and listening are not roles at all. We're not playing parts. As listeners, we're not waiting on our turn to respond. Rather, speakers and listeners are co-narrators, both contributing to a story's telling, even in situations that involve one person sharing their experience and the other who is quote unquote just listening. In the very first study that demonstrated the idea that listeners are co-narrators, Jan Bavelis and her graduate students paired people together, asking one person to share what they called a close call story, while the other person was asked to listen to that story. A close call story is basically something almost happened. So, for instance, one of the examples that they provide is a woman is in her room reading at night. She has a lamp attached to her bed. She falls asleep. And the next thing she knows, she's awakened by her mother because her room is on fire and filling up with smoke. In half of the situations, people are telling this kind of story to a non-distracted listener. And in half of these stories, they are talking to a distracted listener. And they distracted these listeners in a couple of ways. One of the ways was you're sitting across the table with this listener, and they're told, conspicuously to push a button underneath the table that the speaker can't see and can't really notice that you're doing it. Every time that that person uses a word that starts with the letter T, press that button. So that distracts you from fully paying attention to the other person. That distraction manipulation not only influenced listeners who made fewer responses, especially those that are tied to specific moments of the story, like gasping when that woman told that her pillow was on fire, but the narrators also told their stories significantly less well, particularly at what should have been the dramatic ending. And so listeners are co-narrators both through their own specific responses, which helps illustrate the story, and also in their apparent effect on the narrator or storyteller's performance. The results demonstrate the importance of moment by moment collaboration in face to face dialogue. Listeners and speakers make meaning together, collaboratively, in a transaction. But you don't find this kind of language in the self help books or how to be a good listener articles that appear when you do a basic Google search. Instead, what you mainly read about is the importance of being active. So, have you ever tried hard to understand someone and still missed the point? I'd like to illustrate how difficult it is. That is, putting forth effort may not be enough to become a good listener. So, for this activity, I'm going to test your memory. You'll need some way of writing down or typing out the words that you remember after I read a list of words. So I'm going to read a list of words, and your job is to listen and try really, really, really hard to remember as many as you can. Put away your phones, stop doing your email, close the door, put in some ear noise canceling headphones if you need to, and don't write or type anything while I'm reading. When I finish, I'll give you enough time to write or type as many as you can remember. The first few are going to come instantly because you're just accessing what you just heard. But then after about 15 or so seconds, you're going to experience this it's hard moment. And you'll need to pause and think, but I'm going to encourage you not to give up. This is where you're accessing your true memory. You really need to push yourself. You really need to try hard, forcing yourself to remember those words. All right, here we go. Here are 15 words, each of which references something you might find around a house. Door, glass, pane, shade, ledge, sill, house, open, curtain, frame, view, breeze, sash, screen, shutter. You now have 1 minute to write or type as many as you can remember. Most of you have probably paused at this point. Keep going, keep writing, keep typing. You have about 30 seconds. Don't give up. 15 more seconds. Keep writing, keep typing. Squeeze out that last word in the last 5 seconds. All right. How many people thought you did pretty well? And how many of you wish you had a second chance? All right. Wish granted. And what if this time I also let you look at the words on the screen while I read them? Do you think you do better this time? All right. So this time I'm going to read another 15 words, all medically themed, what you would find at a hospital. Nurse, sick, lawyer, medicine, health, hospital, dentist, physician, office, ill, patient, stethoscope, surgeon, clinic, cure. 1 minute. Most of you have paused at least once at this point. It's about 20 seconds, but keep going. Don't give up, keep going. 15 more seconds. Squeeze out that last word or two in the next 5. And how many of you think you did better on the second list than the first list? All right, so looking at your first list, chat in if you wrote or typed the word window. If you typed or wrote out the word window in the first list, you can just put yes or one or something in the chat. And then looking at list number 2, chat in if you wrote or typed the word doctor in list 2. And if you have window in list 1 or doctor in list 2, you've experienced a false memory. Neither of those words were on either of those lists. Window is not on list 1. Doctor is not on list 2. Memory is a pretty lousy videotape, audio tape. There's no correlation between how sure you are of a memory and whether that memory is true or false. You can be absolutely certain about something that never happened. You've likely had something like this happen to you before. You think your partner said one thing, but they swear they've said something else. Or you remember the events in a meeting going one way and your coworker or your supervisor remembers them going completely differently. And this happens to all of us. So the point is more complex than we just can't remember things, though I bet none of you have all 30 words on your paper. In fact, we often remember what was not there. More than 85% of the people who do this experiment will get at least one false memory out of those two lists. And it's not because you did anything wrong. It turns out that study after study has shown that even when you're sure of a certain memory, the odds are good that you're remembering something incorrectly. In this case, each of the word lists are actually designed to take advantage of the brain's tendency to fill in the gaps when looking at a larger picture. In the first list, 65% of people falsely remember the word window, 60% falsely remember doctor in the second list. So hearing things that aren't there is one way we're programmed to be biased. Our cognitive architecture is such that we fill in the gaps even when we're trying really, really hard to comprehend what another person is saying. And of course, it's not always necessary to remember everything a person has said. As Maya Angelou has been quoted as saying, I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And of course, good listening is often equated with empathy, and that's what I want to turn our attention to next. Our second myth, that good listening is empathy. Like listening, there's not a single agreed upon definition of empathy. It's been defined as a multidimensional construct involving emotional connection, perspective taking, validation, and a general focus on feelings, presumably in preference to facts. There's a lot of good attempt in attempting to be more empathic, to connect with people on an emotional level, or to attempt to understand things from their perspective. So, what's my beef with empathy? Why am I claiming that it's a myth? So I want to start with the notion of validation. Among the more commonly accepted indicators of quote unquote good listening is the idea that effective listeners validate the thoughts, feelings, and experiences of the person speaking. The logic is that when a listener reflects or affirms someone's perspective, the speaker feels seen, understood, and accepted. But this ideal quickly becomes complicated when we look at how validation is actually practiced, taught, and measured. First, it's often operationalized as a technique, typically through paraphrasing or reflecting feelings, rather than understood as a relational achievement or co-constructed sense of acknowledgement. The reduction to technique flattens the complexity of what validation might mean across different listeners, speakers, and contexts. While emotional validation has its roots in Rogerian therapy, its popularization through a more simplified version of what I call the active listening paradigm has codified it into a checklist of behaviors: paraphrase, reflect, nod, maintain warmth, done. This codification has led to conflicting assumptions about what counts as helpful. A long-standing debate in the marital literature highlights that tension. John Gottman and his team, relying on observational data, argued that stable marriages were best predicted by effective conflict management, not necessarily empathic or validating exchanges. In contrast, emotion-focused therapists like Susan Johnson insisted that emotional attunement and validation were foundational to relationship security. Their disagreement reveals a broader conceptual split. Are we measuring success in listening by its observable structure or by its felt impact? Similar tensions have been observed in organizational settings where employees report feeling heard not simply because a manager used active listening behaviors, but because they perceived the listener as genuinely responsive, present, and attuned to their needs. These contrasting perspectives suggest that validation is not a fixed ingredient in good listening, but a socially and contextually defined experience. Good listening is not a trait. It is judged in interaction, varies by context, and depends on what the other person needs. What feels like good listening in a crisis debrief versus a research seminar versus a family dinner are all different. Complicating matters further, validation is often conflated not only with care or attentiveness, but with acceptance and even agreement. In both lay and scholarly accounts, listeners are frequently described as adopting a, quote, validating stance, which is assumed to communicate alignment with the speaker's emotional position. LeMay and colleagues in 2023, for instance, define high quality listening as involving both comprehension and, quote, an accepting and validating stance, effectively coupling validation with relational harmony, a framing that may make sense when the goal is communal closeness, but it poses problems in contexts where disagreement, critique, or dissent are part of the conversation. In fact, recent work operationalizes perceived validation with items like the listener agreed with my opinion, suggesting that listening is good only to the extent that it affirms. Such measures risk mistaking ideological alignment for listening skill and overlook forms of engagement that are deeply attentive but productively challenging. If our models of listening equate being heard with being agreed with, we limit the very function of listening in pluralistic, high stakes, or truth seeking contexts. So, back to the conflation of good listening with empathy, I'd like to touch on a second reason that I think it is more myth than truth, and it has to do with the notion of perspective taking. Scholars have identified two distinct ways to, quote unquote, take the perspective of a suffering others. You can imagine yourself in that person's shoes, or what is called imagine self perspective taking. Scholars manipulate this by telling people while you're reading about the other person's problem, try to imagine how you yourself would feel if you were experiencing what has happened to the other person and how this experience would affect your life. You compare that to what scholars call imagine other perspective taking. The prompt is while you're reading about the other person's problem, try to imagine how the other person feels about what has happened and how it has affected his or her life. Both ISPT and IOPT, what I call wearing your shoes or wearing their shoes, lead to empathic concern. People feel more compassionate, they feel more tender, they have better feelings toward the other person. But when you wear their shoes, that additionally leads to higher levels of personal distress or negative self-focused affect. Moreover, wearing their shoes may be more common or likely. People are more likely to default to that mode, meaning that we have to train ourselves not to do it. Otherwise, we kind of contage their negative emotions. In a study that asked people to either engage in imagine self or imagine other perspective taking, and then read a fictional description of a hardship, allegedly written by someone to whom they were to address a video-based supportive message, Buffon and colleagues found that distress was associated with relative physiological threat under imagine self, but not under imagine other conditions. In other words, when you're wearing their shoes, that seems to lead to a physiological state of threat, a state of potentially debilitating arousal when pursuing the goal of helping the other person. When you imagine yourself in another's shoes, you are more likely to be debilitated by stress. Staying in your own shoes while still eliciting a state of heightened distress does not have this debilitating effect. Wearing your own shoes seems to lead to a more invigorating arousal that promotes a challenge-based mindset and ultimately leads to more positive forms of helping. But between these two forms of perspective taking, wearing their shoes or wearing your own shoes, I'm going to insert the idea that we not wear shoes at all. What Epley calls perspective getting. He describes it this way: others' minds will never be an open book. The secret to understanding each other better seems to come not through an increased ability to read body language or improved perspective taking, but rather through the hard relational work of putting people in a position where they can tell you their minds openly and honestly. If we want to understand what's on the mind of another, the best our mortal senses can do may be to rely on our ears more than our inferences. Consider an example of how perspective getting might work. In 1993, the US government signed Don't Ask, Don't Tell, a policy that was brought into law that banned gays and lesbians from serving openly in the military. By 2010, the Obama administration was considering the consequences of repealing the law. Moral implications aside, knowing how current soldiers felt about this repeal was essential for assessing its practical consequences. This is a textbook mind reading problem with at least two approaches to solving it. One is exemplified by the 1,167 retired military officers who used their perspective-taking ability to imagine the consequences for current soldiers of repealing the law. In an open letter to President Obama and members of Congress, they expressed their strong opposition. They wrote, "Our past experience as military leaders leads us to be greatly concerned about the impact of repeal on morale, discipline, unit cohesion, and overall military readiness. We believe that imposing this burden on our men and women in uniform would eventually break the all-volunteer force." Elaine Donnelly, president of the Center for Military Readiness, argued that this opposition must be taken very seriously. She wrote, "They have a lot of military experience and they know what they're talking about." The Pentagon took a second approach to this mind reading problem. Its officials asked the soldiers their opinions directly by surveying over 115,000 soldiers and over 44,000 of their spouses in one of the largest studies in military history. The soldiers themselves expressed relatively few concerns. In fact, 70% believed that the repeal would have no effect or a positive effect on the military. More telling, roughly the same number, 69%, said that they had worked with a gay service member already. Among them, 92% said it had no effect or a positive effect on the unit's ability to work together. From those responses, Defense Secretary Robert Gates concluded that the repeal, quote, would not be the wrenching, dramatic change that many have feared and predicted. Gates pushed for its repeal. So who was right? In 2012, 1 year after the actual repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the military released a study of its consequences. The answer was clear. Soldiers could speak their minds when asked directly, but the retired officers who'd imagined the soldiers' reactions were wrong. The title of the press release says it best: First Study of Openly Gay Military Service Finds Not Event at 1 year mark. Getting the soldiers' perspectives by asking them for it enabled understanding. What's unfortunate about the kind of work that we do is that we attempt to teach people a complex and universally recognized vital life skill against the backdrop that they've been listening their whole lives. How many people on this Zoom room have ever had a class in listening, from grade school to middle school to high school to college to law school to mediator school to fill in the blank? Sometimes it's part of a workshop. It might be a chapter in a textbook, but the majority of us have never had a class directly related to how to listen well. When we assume listening well is easy, that we can just concentrate more, that we can keep our mouths shut, we can somehow turn on our listening ears, we don't spend time cultivating its practice. Likewise, if we spend hours on end practicing to listen well, but don't engage in the appropriate type of practice, we'll end up getting it wrong. We'll listen well in some situations, poorly in others, and then we'll blame our conversational partners for their inability to speak, even while we blame them for being poor listeners when we ourselves are misunderstood. So, if I could leave you with one thing, it's this: people speak for a reason, and good listening means discovering that reason through an attitude of curiosity, through a set of discovery oriented behaviors, and through a mindset that involves taking off your shoes and perhaps your socks and operating in a mode of barefoot listening every once in a while. That's all I've got prepared. I'm happy to entertain questions, comments, pushback, dissent, whatever might come.
Well, thank you. That was just terrific. And I want to open it up to questions from the audience and comments. There was a lot flying around in the chat. So if people have questions and would like to post them in the chat, we're happy to read them out loud. Or if you would simply like to unmute yourself and ask your question to Professor Bodie, the audience is respectful, so please go ahead. While we're waiting for things to start popping in from the audience, let me ask you, Professor. We're on Zoom here now, and a lot of our communications take place electronically, whether it's over a cell phone, a telephone, or online here. And what difference does it make whether we're face to face to people on the phone, uh, on a video screen like this? How do we adapt?
Yeah, great question. Very common question, and much like other questions about human communication, the answer is it depends, right? It depends on a lot of different,
You sound like
yeah, a
a
lot of different, yeah, yes. Comfort with technology. It depends on the relationship that you have with the people that are on the other end. It depends on the expectations of what that meeting is supposed to accomplish. But certainly, the sort of the being on Zoom phenomenon, there's much more tendency for people to think they can multitask, that they can do some email, that they can go over to their other screen, that they can look at their phone and so forth. And although that temptation is there face to face, clearly people look at their phone or look at their watch nowadays when they're face to face. The temptation is just greater online. And the fact that if you don't have a foundation of trust with the people that are on the other end of that Zoom room, you assume that when you see their fingers moving, that they must be doing something else rather than taking notes, rather than doing something that's relevant for that conversation. So you've just got to be careful, particularly about the kinds of distractions that might get in your way in a setting like a Zoom room as opposed to in person.
And then what about dealing with people who we know very well, family members, longtime friends, where a conversation starts and you think, oh, this again, the same complaint, the same
Mm.
story, whatever. How do we maintain fresh ears and attentiveness with people with whom we're very familiar and with whom we may have an expectation of uh, certain kinds of things coming from them?
Yeah, so first and foremost, whether it's someone you know well or someone you don't know well, it's always a good idea to prepare to listen before you go into a conversation. What is it that I'm bringing into that conversation that might be helpful? What are the ways in which I'm attuned to this person that are going to help me listen in ways that are generative for this conversation? And what am I bringing with me baggage wise that might get in the way of my best listening with this person in this moment? I mean, how many people have ever actually prepared to listen? You prepare to speak, right? You prepare to give a debrief, but do you really think about how am I showing up as a listener? What am I doing to make sure that the habits that I'm bringing into this situation are doing their best to help me in that situation? And clearly, if you have that mentality, oh, this again, right? I think I would just challenge you to say, people speak for a reason, right? How many people woke up this morning thinking, I'm going to go into some conversations today saying some things that are irrelevant, irritating, and, we don't do that. No one wakes up thinking, how can I make others' lives more miserable? We wake up thinking, how can I better accomplish my goals today? So if you can give people sort of that grace and assume their best intentions, imagine they're wearing a shirt that says, I'm doing the best I can, right? Then I think that can go a long way in mitigating that tendency to say, oh, here, rolling your eyes and saying, here we go. Again, what is their reason? What's their motivation? Why is it that they're coming to you with this particular issue, problem, or whatever the case might be? And maintain a little bit of an attitude of curiosity toward that story.
I'm going to ask Timothy Olson in just a minute, but I have one more question first. A lot of the people on this line work as mediators, and we come into situations where there are, to say the least, failures to communicate. And so we may be there with people who are they have completely failed at the task of listening to each other. And we're there to coach them or help them or do something to help them listen better to each other. What are some things that we could do in the moment with people? We're kind of parachuted into these situations. We maybe haven't met them at all before the day of the mediation. What are some things that we can do to help to stimulate better listening when we see others not listening well?
Yeah, and I'm not a mediator, so I don't want to necessarily, co-opt the how to be a good mediator conversation. But in terms of helping people kind of be their best communicative, their best listening selves, I think it's important to figure out what are you listening for in those moments, right? If you're simply listening for disagreement or dissension or a reason to pounce, right, to argue, right, as opposed to listening for like underlying values. What do we share? What is the common ground, here? And so I think as mediators, your primary job a lot of times is things like paraphrasing, right, where you're saying, what I'm hearing this person say, what I'm hearing, what you value, what I'm hearing, what you want, and here's how we're trying to, right, mediate what you want versus what this other person wants to try to sort of surface whether or not these people are that far apart from each other, or in fact they're closer, right, than their dissension might otherwise suggest. There's the theory that's been around a long time in the literature called social judgment theory, and it sort of says that the way that we listen when we believe someone, disagrees with us kind of goes like this, right? We hear their opinion, and the first thing that we do is we judge it against our anchor position. We judge it against what we already believe. And based on that judgment, we either think that what they've said is a lot closer to what we believe or a lot further away from what we believe than it actually objectively is. In other words, we hear what they say in light of what we already assume and what we already know. So I think in a large part, what a mediator's job to do in terms of helping people listen across their differences is to realign people about what, right, is said, what was meant, and really what values underlie those statements first and foremost, as opposed to, getting into the nitty-gritty about who is right or who is wrong. And I think in personal relationships outside of the mediation context, I think the main thing is to remember, like, you didn't record it. You're not that commercial where you can throw the challenge flag and you can rewind the tape, right? And you can figure out who said what. because you get into these weird arguments. You're not listening to me. Yes, I am. No, you're not. Or that's not what I said. Yes, it is what I said. It's like nobody knows actually what was said. We only really know what we believe about what was said after it was said, right? So avoiding that tendency to argue about the truth of the matter, right? Unless you actually have a recording or a transcript of something actual, I think it's just a bad idea to go down that rabbit hole.
So again, before I ask Timothy Olson to contribute, do you recommend saying to people things like, um, you may be construing this as much closer or much farther away from what you said or believed? Making these things explicit to people, is that a constructive or helpful thing to do?
I think it can be. I think it can in a way that doesn't like put them on the spot and blame them for that, right? You're misconstruing me. You always do this, right? And then you kind of kitchen sink it and you kind of throw everything out them, right? I mean, John Gottman, who I mentioned earlier, says there's two words you ought to take out of your vocabulary in marital relationships: always and never. No one always does anything, and no one never does. No one never does anything, right? So if you can take those words out of your vocabulary, particularly in a marital relationship, you're likely to be a little happier, a little more satisfied.
Timothy Olson, please unmute yourself and comment or question, please.
Sure, sure. Thank you. This is very interesting, and perhaps given my own listening limitations, I heard quite a bit in the presentation of the shortcomings of many of our current constructs of what listening is about and good listening is about. But I've either missed it, and I'm wanting more of what then? What's the better approach that
Oh,
will make
what?
for how do we evolve to more full, complete, useful listeners? And I almost want a whole new seminar to, you
Yeah.
know, what's the flip side of this?
Yeah, yeah. Well, for the low price. No, so I teach a concept that we call listening intelligence, which basically says that we need to change the question that we're asking. Rather than asking, "Am I a good listener?" We ask the question, "Are my listening habits helping or hindering me in this situation, with this person, in this context?" Right? And so we teach a model that sort of says, you've got to sense yourself. What are my habits? What's getting in the way of my best listening? You've got to connect with others. You've got to ask those same questions about the other person. How do they listen? How might they listen a little differently than I am? How might they construe this situation? And then what are they bringing to the situation that might get in the way of their best listening? If everybody's distracted, right? We all have periods of distraction. So this is it's just sort of just like, I'm going to admit it and acknowledge it, right? And so then once you've kind of sized yourself up, once you've sized up the other person, you kind of get a sense about how you're processing, how they're processing, then you can make adjustments, right? You can adjust not only how you're listening, but you can adjust how you're speaking so that the way in which you speak lands on their ears how you want it to land rather than how it otherwise would land. Um, you know, it open a Psychology 101 book and you get this notion of that we don't see the world in the same way. It's the rabbit or the duck illusion. It's the old woman or young woman. It's the picture of the two people looking at a six or a nine, right? So, but that's true of all of our senses. We don't smell the world the same way. We don't feel the world the same way, and we don't hear the world the same way, right? We all have filters through which we process information. And if you don't believe that, then think about the last meeting you went to with seven other people. You left that meeting having gone to eight different meetings, right? She didn't say that. Yes, she did, right? I mean, it's right. It's endemic, whether it's in the workplace or in family life. So I think again, step one is just like awareness that this is a thing that you can't just like turn on your listening ears and automatically become a good listener universally for all people. And then to recognize all of those behaviors that I might, be down on a little bit, paraphrasing, reflecting feelings, those are not bad things to do. They're not bad places to start. They're just simply insufficient for the kinds of complex conversations you likely find yourself in on a regular basis. And secondly, it's not the case that you can just do them right in some order, like always paraphrase then ask a question, right? Because all questions, right, are biased. They lead the conversation in a particular direction. So how you ask the question and how that question lands on the ears of another person, how they hear your question, right, are going to send them off in a direction that you may or may not have intended. And so just thinking through those dynamics about what it is that you're bringing to the situation, what it is that they're bringing to the situation, and how do you align those sometimes misaligned goals. I think that can go a long way to helping you become a better, more efficient listener.
That's great. It leads to a question in the chat from, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing this right, Theron Raintree. What techniques or tools have you discovered to help mediation clients or people in conflict listen to each other when you have, say, two chest-thumping men who talk past each other, or similarly, a mom and daughter who care about each other deeply but talk past each other? I guess how to help people who are too trapped in ego to collaborate in a conversation.
Wow, I don't know. I think I think in general, the answer is structure, right? When you're at loggerheads, whether that's in a family or in some kind of corporate situation, it's interesting. People conform to the structure that sort of dictates the situation. I mean, we all came here today dressed, right? Why? Right? It's because we want to get dressed? Not necessarily. It's because the situation dictates, right, that we get dressed, right? And so people conform to the structures that sort of say, here's how we're going to agree to communicate with each other. And I imagine many of you do this in your mediation practices. You say, here are the conversation agreements we're going to follow. Here's what, we're going to hear from you, and then we're going to hear from you, and then we're going to do this thing, right? We're going to do this activity or that activity. Unbounded by structure, if everybody gets to bring their own structure to the conversation, right? What ends up happening is that your ship's sailing through the night, right? You're operating on this idea. I'm operating on this other idea, and we're never really going to align on what it is that we want to accomplish in that conversation. So I think structure is the easiest answer to that question. And there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of structures that you could follow. There's a variety of organizations out there that do facilitator guides and different kinds of conversation across difference work that can provide those kinds of structures. Maybe you have your own favorite structure or template or whatever. But I think particularly for conflict, disagreement, these kinds of things, I think structure is of the utmost important, where both people agree this is how we're going to engage in this conversation, and so that both of them or all of them, or as the mediator, you can hold those people accountable to those structures.
Thank you. David Schraga, please unmute yourself and ask away.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Thanks for a great presentation, Professor Bodie. One of the things that I thought was very interesting was when you were speaking about transactional listening and the effect that I've seen in studies when the speaker has an ability to read the reactions of the listener, and how the narrative quality goes down when you can't actually see those reactions or respond to them. And it made me think about something that I think probably a lot of folks can relate to, which is when many of us often present to audiences. A lot of what we've talked about today is one-on-one communication, but oftentimes we're presenting to audiences, presenting via Zoom, presenting in a live room. And in many of these webinar structures, we can all see each other today on this Zoom, for example, but in many webinars, you're just presenting into the void. You can't see anybody's face.
Hmm.
And oftentimes when you're presenting even to this type of environment or to a live audience, you obviously can read the room and people's reactions. And so I'm wondering, when you can't see anybody, are there any tips that you have for us in terms of how we can potentially stay more engaged with the narrative storytelling, ways to deal with that, to prepare ourselves for that? And the second question is, when you're in a room and you are seeing people's reactions, how do you make sure that you're not necessarily tripped up by that too much, by the false
Yeah.
positive? I think
Yeah. Yeah. One of them is that I didn't talk about that, your comment and your question made me think of is this idea that 93% of human communication is nonverbal. Anybody heard that? Right? It's a terrible statistic. It's not even true from the original study. But it certainly is popular, right? And so what I tell my students is if you don't believe me that that's a myth, what I want you to do is go to your favorite streaming service, right? Choose a comedy special, press play, and then mute. And now you're rolling on the floor 93% of the time, right? So much of the emotional content of communication is done through nonverbals, and the way that someone positions their body, the way that they react with their face, can tell us something about how they're probably processing what it is that we're saying. Um, but there's a habit of listening that we call connective listening, relational listening, listening for emotions and feelings. And those individuals tend to do your stereotypical active listening. They're like leaning forward and nodding their head, and they look like, they're like really supportive and they're really engaged, and they might be doing a grocery list in their head, right? You have no idea what's happening in their head just because they look like they're engaged, right? So nonverbals are imperfect indicators of what's happening. They're imperfect indicators about whether someone's paying attention or not, right? And so you just got to have to be careful about assuming a lot of things about whether or not you've got an audience engaged, right, based on that. Now, there's some clear, counter examples. If someone is doing this, you know, they're probably focused on their phone and not necessarily focused on me. So there, maybe yes, there are some telltale signs of distraction, but for the most part, most of us are distracted. At least some of the time in all of our conversations, our mind wanders. We start thinking about something else. What you said made me interested in this thing over here, and so I start thinking about that thing over there, right? And so it's just a fact of life. And so in a personal relationship, being able to acknowledge that, hey, I was distracted. I'm sorry about that. Forgive me. Can you please repeat, what you said? And then to your kind of, to your initial question is that like, how do you prepare best for like a large audience that you may or may not be able, to see? Yeah, there's going to be a mix of ways in which people are processing your message. So you've got to think through what are all those perspectives, right, likely to be. And even better yet, you might do some sort of questionnaire beforehand and ask them, what do they already believe or know about the topic? What do they expect out of this workshop, right? And then try to answer some of those expectations within, feed those data. So in the workshops that I run in corporations, I always start with a pre-questionnaire where I get some baseline data, and I'll come in with those data saying like, here's what you told me in the survey, right? And here's how we're going to use that information to kind of address some of the things that you want to accomplish as a team inside of what I'm going to offer with respect to listening. So I think knowing where the audience is, beforehand, doing some audience analysis can go a long way to making sure your message resonates, even if you can't see the people that you're presenting to.
That's great. Thank you. We have just about a minute minute left, Graham. Let's talk bibliography. I'm sure I am, and I'm sure many other people are interested in more information on this. Are there any books or articles that you have written or books or articles that you would recommend to us if we want some further insights on these topics?
If you want to nerd out with the academic research, my website is grahambodie.com. Everything that I publish goes there. And then in terms of books, there used to be a Listen Like a Lawyer website. I don't know if she runs that website anymore. That was a really a solid resource for lawyers in particular. Susan Brooks writes a little bit about relational lawyering and listening and lawyering. She's written a couple of things for us that are a little bit more academic, in nature. And then yeah, there's several books. I've got a lot of them on, my shelf. And the most recent one is this book called Deep Listening. It's a good book. There's a book by Kate Murphy. I think it's called like You're Not Listening or something like that. That's a decent book. But so those off the top of my head are suggestions for this audience.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor Graham Bodie from the University of Mississippi. I know I'll be contributing to the Pantry of Oxford and Lafayette County in your honor. It's www.oxfordmscares.com. That's www.oxfordmscares.com. Thank you so much, Graham Bodie, for a really fascinating and stimulating presentation. We had a wonderful, large audience, attentive audience today. Thank you so much. And with that, we are complete.